What the hell is she doing here? The words rang through the air, sharp and full of disgust. Conversations halted, heads turned. But I didn't flinch. I took my time, stepping forward with confidence, my heels clicking against the polished marble floor of the Grand Summit Conference Hall. The room was drowning in wealth, crystal chandeliers, champagne flowing in golden streams, power radiating from every corner. And yet, every pair of eyes in this room was on me. I met their gazes head-on, unfazed. I had expected this reaction. After all, the Kingsleys had spent the last 14 years pretending I didn't exist. My name is Clara Sullivan, and when I was 18, my family threw me away like I was nothing. They never thought they'd see me again. They were wrong. And tonight, they would finally understand who I had become. I scanned the crowd until my eyes landed on Diana Kingsley, my mother. She stood frozen, her usual poised expression faltering. Her manicured fingers gripped the stem of her champagne glass, the tension in her shoulders betraying her calm facade. Beside her, Philip Kingsley, my stepfather, the man who stole everything from me, stared at me with narrowed eyes, already calculating, always scheming. And then, of course, there was Theo Kingsley, my stepbrother, the golden child, the one they chose over me. Theo crossed his arms, smirking like the entitled brat he always was. "You're not on the guest list," he said smoothly. "Who let you in?" I tilted my head. "Oh, Theo," I mused, my voice dripping with amusement. Still so desperate to control everything. His smirk faltered for just a second. But he wasn't the one I was interested in. It was James Carter. Standing next to Theo, James, his business partner and fiancé, looked like he had seen a ghost. His face was pale. His fingers twitched around his glass. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He knew, and he was terrified. I smiled. "James," I said softly, "you seem uncomfortable." He flinched at the sound of my voice. Philip's gaze snapped to him. "James, what's wrong?" Theo frowned, glancing between us. "What the hell is going on?" I took a slow, deliberate step closer, lowering my voice just enough for James to hear. "Do you really not know anything?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. The tension in the room was suffocating, and just like that, the night that was supposed to be their victory began to unravel. I still remember the night they threw me away. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't explosive. There were no screaming matches or shattered plates. It was calculated. Cold, final. Philip Kingsley stood by the grand entrance of the estate, his arms crossed over his chest. My mother, Diana, was behind him, her eyes cast downward, as if looking at me would make this real. I was 18, and I had nothing. The rain had just started to drizzle, dampening the pavement outside. My suitcase sat at my feet, pathetically small. A single bag was all they thought I was worth. Philip's voice was calm, almost bored. "You're an adult now, Clara. It's time you start acting like one." I looked at my mother, begging her, pleading. "Mom, please." She flinched, but she didn't speak. Theo, my stepbrother, was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, an infuriating smirk on his lips. "Don't waste your breath," he said lazily. "She's not going to help you." I swallowed hard. My chest was tight. "Where am I supposed to go?" Philip sighed, rubbing his temple like I was an annoying burden. "That's not our concern anymore." Not their concern, not their problem, not their family. I clenched my fists. "This isn't fair." Theo laughed. Actually laughed. "Fair? Oh, Clara, grow up. Life isn't fair. You think we're going to keep paying for you to sit around wasting space?" My throat burned. "Dad left me that trust fund." "Your father," Philip interrupted sharply, "left a mess that I had to clean up. That trust fund, gone. Used for better purposes." Better purposes. I stared at him, my stomach twisting into knots. He had stolen my father's money, my inheritance, and he wasn't even ashamed. I turned to my mother again, one last time, one last chance. "You're really going to let him do this?" She inhaled shakily. Then she looked away, like I wasn't even there. That was when I knew. They had already erased me. Theo took a lazy step forward, grinning. Face it, Clara, you were never really part of this family. The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. Philip stepped aside, gesturing toward the door. We've done more than enough for you. It's time you stand on your own 2 feet. I was shaking. Not from the cold, not from fear, but from the sheer injustice of it all. I had spent my whole life trying to prove myself to them, trying to earn my place, and they never intended to let me belong. I clenched my jaw, holding back the tears. I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. So I picked up my bag. I stepped into the rain, and I walked away. They never looked back. But I did. I let my gaze sweep over them now, standing in their lavish suits and designer gowns. Theo, so smug in his tailored tux. Philip, still as calculating as ever. My mother, clutching her champagne, like it was the only thing holding her together. They thought I had disappeared. But I was still here, and I wasn't finished. James, Theo's fiancé, still hadn't moved. His grip on his glass was too tight, his breathing shallow. He knew something. I leaned in slightly, just enough for him to hear. You recognize me, don't you? He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Theo scoffed. Enough of this. I don't know what game you're playing, but no one here cares about some girl who... James spoke, cutting him off. She's not just some girl, Theo. The room went dead silent. Theo's smirk flickered. What? James swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. She's Clara Sullivan. Philip stiffened. My mother inhaled sharply. And Theo actually took a step back. I smiled, slow, deliberate. You didn't think I'd survive, did you? I murmured, tilting my head. You didn't think I'd make it past 18. Theo's mouth opened, but no words came out. I took another step forward, letting my voice drop to a near whisper. Well, surprise? Theo actually stumbled backward. His usual smirk was gone. His lips parted slightly, as if his mind was racing to come up with an explanation, a way to spin this into something meaningless. But there was no escaping it. I was not supposed to be here. Not at this event. Not in their world. I let the moment hang, savoring the weight of their shock. Philip's hand twitched at his side. My mother's fingers tightened around her champagne glass. But it was James Carter who looked the most unsettled. His breathing was uneven. His grip on his drink was unsteady. And I could see it in his eyes. He was remembering something. Something that made his entire body stiffen with fear. I took a slow step forward. You look like you've seen a ghost, James. He flinched. Theo's gaze snapped to him. What the hell is going on? James didn't answer. I tilted my head, watching the tension rise. You do remember me, don't you? His throat bobbed. A flicker of panic crossed his face. Then Philip spoke, his voice cutting through the tension. That's enough. His tone was sharp, commanding, a last-ditch attempt to regain control. I turned to him. Enough? Oh, Philip, we're just getting started. Theo scoffed, shaking off his moment of weakness. He squared his shoulders, attempting to regain his arrogant composure. All right, I've had enough of this little show. He gestured toward me dismissively. Whatever you're trying to pull, it's not working. I smiled. Is that so? I reached into my clutch and pulled out a neatly folded document. With deliberate care, I unfolded it and held it up for them to see. James went rigid. His entire body locked up like someone had just pressed a gun to his back. Theo frowned, glancing at the paper. What's that supposed to be? I turned it slightly, just enough for James to see the header at the top. His eyes darted across the page. I could see the moment the words registered. The color drained from his face. Philip took a step closer, his patience thinning. I asked you a question, Clara. I didn't look at him. My gaze was locked on James, watching him, waiting. James exhaled sharply. Then, finally, he spoke. Where did you get that? Philip's expression darkened. He turned to James. You know what that is? James clenched his jaw. He did. Theo rolled his eyes. Oh, for God's sake, stop being so dramatic. He turned to me. You think flashing a random piece of paper is going to scare us? I raised a brow. Random? I took a step forward, lowering my voice just enough to make them lean in. This isn't just a random piece of paper, Theo. It's a financial record, one that proves, without a doubt, that Kingsley Group has been funneling money through a series of fraudulent charities. Theo's smirk vanished. Philip's entire posture stiffened. And James looked like he wanted to disappear. Bullshit, Theo hissed, but there was an edge to his voice now, a crack in his confidence. I smiled. Would you like to read it yourself? I extended the paper toward him, but he didn't take it. Philip stepped in instead, yanking it from my hand. His eyes scanned the document quickly, his brow furrowing deeper with each line he read. Silence, thick, suffocating. My mother finally spoke. This is nonsense, she said, though her voice was a fraction too tight. You expect us to believe you? Philip cut her off. His fingers clenched the paper so tightly it nearly crumpled in his hands. His gaze snapped to James. You told me these records were buried. The room froze. Theo's head whipped toward his father. Wait, what? James didn't answer. He was staring at Philip, his entire body rigid. Philip took a step forward. You said the books were clean. A single bead of sweat slipped down James's temple. Theo's brows furrowed. Dad, what the hell are you talking about? I tilted my head, watching the scene unfold. Oh, you didn't tell him, did you, Philip? Philip's jaw locked. Theo turned to his father, growing more agitated. Tell me what? Silence. Then James spoke. They laundered millions through fake charities, Theo. The words hit the room like a bomb. Theo staggered back. What? James exhaled shakily, raking a hand through his hair. Kingsley Group isn't as clean as you think. His voice was hollow, filled with a dread that had been buried for too long. Theo's eyes darted between James and his father, realization dawning on him. You knew? His voice cracked. Dad, you knew? Philip didn't answer. His silence said everything. My mother swallowed hard, her fingers trembling around her glass. The truth was unraveling. Their perfect little world was starting to collapse. And this was just the beginning. For a long moment, no one moved. Philip's grip on the financial records was so tight his knuckles turned white. Theo stood frozen, his gaze darting between his father and James, his face contorted with disbelief. My mother, Diana, remained eerily quiet, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. This was it. The moment I had spent years preparing for. I took a step forward, letting my heels click against the marble floor, the sound slicing through the heavy silence. You thought you buried this, I said, my voice calm, almost amused. You thought no one would ever find out. Philip finally snapped out of his stupor. He turned to James, his expression venomous. I paid you a fortune to make sure this never saw the light of day. James staggered back, shaking his head. Philip, I didn't know she had. You didn't know? I mocked. Oh, James, you poor thing. I placed a hand over my heart, feigning sympathy. Did you really think I wouldn't come back for what's mine? Theo let out a sharp breath. This can't be real. His voice was strained, but the fear was there. James exhaled shakily. It is. Theo's world shattered in that moment. He lunged forward, snatching the document from Philip's hands, scanning the lines, his breathing growing heavier with every word. Fraud! His voice cracked. Money laundering. Millions? I crossed my arms. Oh, and let's not forget the tax fraud. Theo snapped his head up, his face pale. What? I smiled. You see, Kingsley Group hasn't just been moving money illegally. They've also been filing fraudulent tax returns for over a decade. Philip's face drained of color. James ran a hand through his hair, his panic turning into pure dread. The IRS, he muttered. I nodded. Already informed. Silence. Dead. Suffocating. Silence. Theo let the paper slip from his fingers. No. 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 He turned to Philip, his voice rising in anger. You told me we were clean. You said Kingsley Group was untouchable. Philip opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing to say, because he knew it was over. Theo's breathing was ragged, his hands clenched into fists. You destroyed everything! Philip's temper finally snapped. I did what I had to do! He turned on Theo, his face twisting in frustration. You think running a company is a game? You think we stay on top by playing fair? Theo took a step back, shaking his head. You! He stopped. Then his eyes narrowed. He turned back to me. This is what you wanted, isn't it? His voice was low, dangerous. I didn't blink. Yes. His lips curled into something bitter. You think you won? I smiled. Oh, Theo. I took another step forward, lowering my voice just enough for only him to hear. I haven't even played my final move yet. His brow furrowed. What the hell does that mean? I tilted my head, feigning curiosity. You never really asked how I got in here, did you? James's eyes widened. Philip stiffened. Theo's jaw clenched. What are you talking about? I reached into my clutch and pulled out a sleek black USB drive. I held it up, letting the overhead lights glint off the metal. Philip's entire body locked up. James took a step forward, his voice tight with panic. Clara, what is that? I twirled the USB between my fingers. This! I let my voice drop into something almost playful. Oh, this is just every single confidential email, transaction, and contract Kingsley Group tried to erase. Philip actually staggered. My mother made a strangled noise, realization hitting her like a freight train. Theo took a breath, trying to compose himself. You're bluffing. I raised a brow. Am I? I turned slightly, glancing over my shoulder at the giant LED screen positioned behind the event stage. The same screen that had just been playing the Kingsley Group promotional video for investors. Then I looked toward the event's tech crew. A man in a headset gave me a small nod. Philip saw it too. His expression turned into pure terror. No. His voice came out hoarse. Clara, don't. I smiled. Then I turned back to the tech crew and said, Play it. The screen flickered. The Kingsley Group logo disappeared. And then, their crimes were broadcast to the entire room. The room erupted in chaos, gasps, murmurs, the sound of shattered illusions filling the air. The massive LED screen displayed every single crime Kingsley Group had tried to bury. Emails, wire transfers, falsified documents, all of it. Philip lunged toward me, his face red with rage. Turn it off! Now! Security moved in, cutting him off before he could reach me. Too late. The damage was done. Philip spun toward the guests, desperate to regain control. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a fabrication, a ridiculous attempt to slander my company. He let out a forced laugh, but his voice cracked. None of this is real. A deep, authoritative voice cut through the air. Then you won't mind answering a few questions, Mr. Kingsley. Every head turned toward the entrance. Federal agents, dressed in dark suits, badges flashing under the chandelier light. Philip's entire body went rigid. One of the agents stepped forward, pulling a document from his coat. Philip Kingsley, you are under investigation for financial fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. His eyes flickered to the screen, still flashing with incriminating evidence. And judging by this, I'd say we have enough to proceed. My mother let out a strangled gasp. Theo froze in place, his face completely drained of color. Philip turned back to me, his voice low and full of venom. You planned this. I didn't deny it. I smiled. This is what happens, I said, when you steal from the wrong person. The agent stepped forward. Mr. Kingsley, you need to come with us. Philip snapped. He turned to Theo, grabbing him by the shoulders. Fix this. His voice was wild, desperate. Call someone. Do something. But Theo couldn't move. He just stood there, watching the empire his father built burn to the ground. Two agents grabbed Philip by the arms. He struggled, his shouts turning into a pathetic plea. "I'm Philip Kingsley. I built this company. He never got to finish. Because the moment he was dragged away, the reporters rushed in. Cameras flashed. Journalists shouted. The Kingsley family, once untouchable, once powerful, was now a public scandal unfolding in real time. James stepped away from Theo, his face hard with realization. "You lied to me," he muttered. "You and your father, this whole time." Theo's voice was thin, desperate. "James, wait, I can explain." "No!" James ripped off his engagement ring and threw it to the floor. "We're done." Theo stared in horror, but James was already gone. And then, the whispers started. Investors, business partners, people who had once admired the Kingsleys were now distancing themselves. One by one, they turned their backs. Diana Kingsley finally moved, her eyes darting around in panic. She turned to me. "Clara, please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You've made your point. You've punished Philip, but we can fix this." I blinked. Then I laughed. "Fix this? There is no fixing this, Mother." My voice was calm, but I could feel the weight of 14 years of betrayal settling in my chest. "You chose him over me, over and over again." Her hands clasped together, desperation flickering in her eyes. "I didn't have a choice." I took a slow step forward. Neither did I. And then, I turned my back on her, just like she did to me. I walked through the wreckage of the Kingsley dynasty, stepping over the remnants of their legacy. Theo, standing in stunned silence. My mother, abandoned and alone. Philip, gone, dragged away to face the consequences of his crimes. I felt lighter, like a weight had finally lifted off my shoulders. And as I reached the exit, I found Ryan waiting for me. He didn't say a word. He just smiled, took my hand, and led me outside. The city lights sparkled around us. The air was cool, crisp, fresh, like a new beginning. Ryan squeezed my fingers. "So," he mused, "how about some champagne?" I let out a small chuckle. "You know what?" I turned to him, grinning. "That sounds perfect." Because tonight wasn't about revenge, it was about freedom. And for the first time in my life, I was finally free. Comment the number 2 if you think the Kingsleys got exactly what they deserved. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this.